So welcome to our next lecture. We were started chapter 11 in part 2 of the Moreh Nevuchim in the last lecture. So I want to start from the beginning of chapter 11 because it's been a couple weeks and because it's kind of hard to start in the middle. So it's in the Pines, it's page 273. And in this chapter, the Rambam is going to, if you remember in the last chapter, he talked about the spheres and he talked about how a lot of things could be boiled down to categories of four. Today in this chapter, let's start. He says, "Know with regard to the astronomical matters mentioned, that if an exclusively mathematical-minded man reads and understands them, he will think that they form a cogent demonstration that the form and number of the spheres is as stated." In other words, if you simply are using the mathematics, right, and how all these spheres work together, then if that's all the only perspective that you have is that, then you'd assume that everything works according to the formulas, right? But the truth is that now things are not like this, and this is not what is sought in the science of astronomy. The fact is, when we look and we make observations, they don't seem to correlate with all of the concepts that I just told you. So the Rambam here is basically admitting that the science of astronomy, that as he described, it doesn't seem to be perfect. Thus, it has been demonstrated. So some of these matters are indeed founded on the demonstration that they are that way. In other words, some things that we see do seem to follow the rules, right? Thus, it has been demonstrated that the path of the sun is inclined against the equator. About this, there is no doubt. But there has been no demonstration whether the sun has an eccentric sphere or an epicycle. So in other words, an epicycle is a term that Ptolemy used to describe cycles within other cycles. Like there's a big circle, a sphere, and then on the sphere, there's things that go around in their own ways. He used that to describe the fact that in reality, what we see doesn't correlate with what we would expect to see if we had these nice, even, neat spheres just rotating around each other. So we don't know for sure exactly what kind of sphere the sun has. So again, Rambam is admitting here that the astronomy has a long way to go. Now, the master of astronomy does not mind this, for the object of that science is to suppose as a hypothesis an arrangement that renders it possible for the motion of the star to be uniform and circular with no acceleration or deceleration or change in it, and to have the inferences necessarily following from the assumption of that motion agree with what is observed, right? So in other words, he tries at the same time, the astronomer seeks as much as possible to diminish motions in the number of the spheres. So he's trying as hard as he can to take all of these rules and fit it to reality, and also to try to boil them down to the lowest possible number of rules and motions, which is the common rule in physics, is that if you have a million different rules explaining a phenomenon, then you're probably not right. The physics is constantly in search, science is constantly in search of less and less and less rules, which can give you an understanding of what's going on. For if we assume, for instance, that we suppose as a hypothesis an arrangement by means of which the observations regarding the motions of one particular star can be accounted for through the assumption of 3 spheres, and another where the assumption needs 4 spheres, you'd rather postulate the lesser number of motions. I paraphrase the sentences in my words. So the bottom line is, Rambam's admitting what's all we often call Occam's razor. But if one rule, right, can explain everything, that's better than saying there's 3 different rules that explain everything, right? We want to boil it down to the simplest number. It's the physics constantly trying to find the search for the grand unified theory, for the one rule, the one equation that sums it all up, okay? For this reason, we have chosen, in the case of the sun, the hypothesis of eccentricity, as Ptolemy mentions, rather than that of an epicycle. even though Rambam admits that we don't know which one is true. In accordance with this purpose, and in view of the fact that we have apprehended that the motions of all the stars constitute one immutable motion in which the relative positions don't change, we are therefore confident that they're all situated in one sphere. Those are all the distant stars, right? Not the planets. Now, it is not impossible, it could be, that each one is in its own sphere, while the motions of these stars are one and the same. And it just happens to be that they rotate in unison. And there's no way to know, with all of these spheres being situated in the same poles, right? So in other words, there's no way to know this for sure. In that case, the number of intellects would be equal to that of the stars, right? And he brings the pasuk, is there any number of his armies? It means because of their multiplicity. Okay. So now, bottom line being that Rambam is admitting that astronomy in his day hasn't yet clarified a whole bunch of things, right? Which for us as people with hindsight, we understand the confusion that people had in those days trying to figure out astronomy based on an Earth-centric system. And it wasn't until Galileo came around, and Copernicus, that figured out that it doesn't work that way, right? But all of this confusion, Rambam is admitting to this confusion. So thus, even on this hypothesis, our ordering of the universe, in which we counted the sphere of the fixed stars as one sphere, just as we have counted the five, would not be disarranged. For as you have understood, our purpose here is to count all of the forces that we have apprehended in a general way, without troubling to give a precise account of the true reality of the intellects in the spheres. In other words, I'm not going to be able to explain that to you, so I'm not even going to try. But the general idea that there are these spheres, right, and there are intellects that drive the spheres, that tell the spheres to go in the way that they go, is the truth. The Rambam is saying, right? That's the way it works. Now we know today that it's not true in the sense of physics, but that's how it was understood by him. So for the Creator may he be exalted, right? Then our intended purpose is to show that everything besides God Himself, in other words, all of the universe, are divided into three parts. One of them is the separate intellects. In other words, those intellects that drive the motion of the spheres, right? And drive the motion of every being in the universe. The second, by the bodies of the spheres, the bodies themselves, right? And on top of page 275, which bodies are substrata to permanent forms in such a way that a form, in other words, in those spheres, they don't change, right? The stars never change, the planets never change, they'll always be that way. And the third is what we see on this world, which are the bodies that are subject to generation and corruption, which have one matter in common. So that's my point. Okay, so after all the interesting thing about all that stuff that I just read, which was confusing, and I admit that it was confusing, is because Rambam is trying to say that it's deliberately confusing. And it's interesting from a historical perspective when we read it to understand that the astronomers of the day recognized that there were tons of stuff that they hadn't yet figured out and didn't make sense based on their understanding. And that confusion took several hundred years until finally they figured out that they had it all wrong. But the Rambam hadn't yet, he wasn't alive at the time that they figured that out, right? So it is further to show, and another thing that, so number one, I just want to make a point. Rambam says that there's God, and then there's the universe, and the universe has spheres, right, within which everything is not changing, right? There's intellects that make those spheres go around, and then there's this third category, which is on this world, where things generate and corrupt. Things come into being, they come alive, they're born, and then eventually they corrupt, they die, they wither away. It is further to show, the other thing I want to show is that governance overflows from the deity. Now, this idea of God's governance overflowing he's going to describe in detail in chapter 12, right? But to the intellects according to their rank. So there is this overflow of something, of some essence, or of some energy, or those aren't the words that Rambam uses. I'm trying to use a modern word that God gives to the entire world, that overflows from God into the world. And he's going to describe it in more detail, like I said, very soon, right? To the intellects according to their rank, and that from the benefits received by the intellects, good things and lights overflow to the bodies of the spheres, right? Because those intellects receive that flow from God, right? But that's the power that God gives to the world that makes the world move and go and exist, right? Those intellects that run the spheres receive that and use that in order to decide and make the spheres rotate, right? Because of the greatness of the benefits they have received from their principles, forces and good things overflow. And then from there, because they get that from God, it overflows lower down, eventually into the world which we live in, where the energy that comes originally from God eventually comes to our intellects and gives us the ability to make decisions to do things on this world. And everything that happens in this world, it's happening by some form of intellect making it happen. So the term intellect isn't the best term, because we understand it differently than Rambam understood it. But intellect is that force that receives a flow from up above, right? Which is the energy that makes the world go around. Now, one of the things that, if I can go on a little aside here, one of the things that makes this so important is, and it actually makes it kind of difficult, is, and I've mentioned this many times, and I'm going to continue to do so, is how do we apply this knowledge to our understanding of physics today, and how that should affect our world? Like, what does Rambam have to teach us today, right? And I'm gonna read the next paragraph with that idea in mind, and I'm going to give you an example of how I believe. Now, a lot of different philosophers, a lot of teachers, a lot of people that learn more in Nevuchim have different ways of taking this Rambam, and trying to apply it to our knowledge today. In other words, because some people will just say, this is all meaningless today. Other parts of more Nevuchim, fine. But all this stuff, all this overflows and intellects, and this is Aristotelian physics. This is not modern physics. But I believe that we can very much apply it to today, and I'll explain how later. And the basic idea that I've pretty much been consistent with until now is to say that Rambam this is his science, right? And he's using science to explain, right, everything he sees. So everything is being explained on the basis of science, not on the basis of what some people today would call a mystical explanation of what's happening. Like there's some spiritual force. Rambam is looking at all of this as physics. This is how he understood the way the world worked, according to Aristotle, right? And I believe that and of course, with the absolute danger in ever saying what Rambam would have said, because no one would ever know that. But I do believe that it's pretty reasonable to assume that he would have said something along the lines of, let's take modern science and understand everything about this world and how this works, including how our minds and our brains work and how we interact with God in a scientifically valid way. That, I think, is a reasonable assumption to make. And I'm going to give an example when we read the next paragraph, which is very important. So the next paragraph, Rambam says as follows. No. Well, actually, you know what? I'm going to paraphrase it in my own words rather than read it. Okay? If someone were to have a human-centric view of the universe, what I believe, and it's that Rambam, his entire philosophy is based in many ways. You can almost understand the whole Sefer Mor Nevuchim, that it's based on the idea of humility. It's based on the idea of how puny and little and nothing we are, right? And how vast and incredible, not only God's creation, but then much more so than that, God is. Because God is so vast and so tremendous that even to use the word vast is incorrect, right? So if we look at everything in the world as if we are the purpose of it all, right? Then you would assume the following, right? If we would assume that if you take a haughty view of the world and make it a human-centric world, that the reason why God created all of this and what makes everything so great is because ultimately he wanted there to be human beings, right? Which is a view that many, possibly even most religious philosophers might take, right? I don't know if it's most or not. It's not a view that Rambam takes, and we're going to see this in a second, right? But if you do look at it that way, so then you would imagine as follows, right? The shefa, the flow, the overflow that comes from God through the higher spheres to the lower spheres, eventually coming into the world that we live in, the world of generation and corruption, right? what you'd basically be saying is that the all of that was created, right, for the purpose of us. So we that represent life on this planet are nobler or greater than those spheres that are above us, right? And if you say that, then what you're saying is the closer you get to God, so to speak, the less and less noble, the less and less great, the less and less holy, the less and less important those objects are. What you're saying then is that those spheres from which we get our sustenance, from which we come, right, we're only here for us. And Rambam therefore emphasizes that that's not the case at all, right? But rather, it's the entire universe is created for its own purpose, right? Everything that exists for its own purpose, right? This is not the only place where Rambam emphasizes this. And and then what happens is that in those upper spheres they get so much flow from God, right? There's so much energy, so much power, so much might that they can't help but give it to the next layer. They can't help, then the next layer can't help but give it to the next layer because they're overflowing with so much power and might and grandeur and greatness that it keeps on coming down eventually to us, right? But to state that we are the purpose of it all would be a philosophical absurdity, right? And Rambam then compares it at the end of this paragraph. He says it's similar, if you imagine, to to uh, to somebody who is very wealthy, right? But he's only wealthy enough to support himself. So he has everything he needs. He has a house, he has a car, he has food, he has the right furniture, he can pay his electric bills, but that's it. He can't help anybody else, right? Well, or you have another person who has so much wealth coming in, right, that he has everything he needs, and then he takes the rest and gives it to someone else and helps out somebody else, right? That is how it works in the real world, Rambam says, right? The energy that flows from the spheres that are above us that bring us into existence, right, is 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 coming because it comes to us because there's this overflow, this tremendous overflow of energy that comes from up above. Okay, now I promised you that I would then say, how does Rambam then apply to modern times, right? How would we apply this, right? If the physics of and the Rambam's physics made sense to him to say that you have this overflow of energy coming from one sphere to another, right? The philosophical um, lesson, according to Rambam, is then that we are just an end result. We are getting the overflow of the overflow of the overflow. We're the puny little nobody that's getting the leftovers of the leftovers of the leftovers. That's the philosophical lesson that we should learn from that in order to realize how small and tiny we are in comparison to these vast and tremendous creations that are above us, that have so much more power and are so much more close to God, right? So it's a tremendous amount of humility. Now, if you now then go ahead and say, let's look at it with modern physics, okay? And I'm not a modern physicist, but let's just imagine for a moment, right, that we look at ourselves as the end result of this tremendous process, right? This process of a big bang, the process of all the interactions between atomic particles, between electrons and neutrons and protons, and then the subatomic particles that eventually this big bang happened and made planets and stars and solar systems and eventually came out of life and so on and so forth. And eventually life evolved, from a single cell to multi-cells to eventually to human beings, right? We think of ourselves as the end result of the processes which were started and run and powered by this energy that God put into the universe, right? So the same philosophical lesson can be learned if we use modern physics or if we use Maimonidean/Aristotelian physics. And I think this is crucial because this is the kind of approach that I'm going to take. And I admit that it's somewhat controversial in modern day Maimonidean scholars, but it's the approach that I've been taking and will continue to take when we read these kinds of things. So when we read Rambam tell us about Aristotelian physics, and then he makes a philosophical conclusion from it, I'm going to try to say, well, what if we used modern physics? Can we make the same philosophical conclusion? To say that Rambam would have agreed with me, obviously I can't. I don't know for sure. but I certainly think that it's consistent with his thinking, and it's using the teaching that he's teaching us in order to make similar conclusions that are more relevant to you and I today. I hope that makes sense. Okay? So now we'll continue this chapter. I hope at the bottom of 275. I just kind of paraphrased that paragraph, so I'm skipping it. The bottom paragraph starts, moreover, a certain other act of bringing into being overflows from every separate intellect until the spheres come to an end with the sphere of the moon. Remember, the sphere of the moon is the lowermost sphere. Interestingly, I just heard on the news today that tonight is like a super moon, right? Where the moon is closest to, like it's closest in its orbit to Earth, right? So, and it's so close that it looks really big, so it's called a supermoon. But it also exerts, remember Rambam mentioned in the last chapter about how the moon has power over water, right? So they were talking about this hurricane and why the surge might be larger, because the tide itself, the surge comes on top of the tide of the storm surge of this hurricane, right? The tide itself is much higher because the moon is even closer. It's just interesting relevance of today's news to what we're learning. But and then after that, there's the body subject to generation and corruption. That's the world we live in. I mean, the first matter and what is composed of it. Furthermore, forces from every sphere enter the elements, right? The forces that are being generated by these spheres enter the elements. Remember the four elements that make up Earth, which is earth, air, wind, and fire. I'm sorry, water and fire, right? Until their overflow is completed with the completion of generation and corruption. Now, this next paragraph, I believe, is extraordinarily interesting and kind of it's very surprising. It should. I'm just have to pull up a few things on my other computer here. Give me a second. So we have already explained that all these views do not contradict anything said by our prophets and the sustainers of our law. So now this is classic Rambam, and this is extremely important and extremely relevant. Remember that this entire book is written, right? Because Rambam felt that the way people interpret and understand the Torah contradicts what science teaches, right? What philosophy and science taught, and how do we get around that contradiction? So Rambam is saying now, I just went on this whole speech about spheres and intellects and all this Aristotelian stuff, right? The Torah doesn't seem to say anything about this. So how does this all work? And Rambam says, well, this doesn't contradict the Torah at all, right? And he says, for our community, and here it's important to pay attention to his words, because to the Rambam it's inconceivable to state, right, that it's just absolutely inconceivable to state that the Torah conflicts with science, right? It just can't be, because if something is scientifically true, it can't be that the Torah conflicts with it. So therefore, for our community is a community that is full of knowledge and is perfect, as he has made clear through the intermediary of the Master who made us perfect, saying, surely this great community is a wise and understanding people. When the Torah says that by keeping the Torah, we are a wise and understanding people, and that's a verse in Devarim, Perek Daled, right? It's inconceivable. What Rambam interprets that to mean is that we are smart and we understand science, right? Right? So if the Torah were to tell us that what I just taught you is true scientifically is not true, then we wouldn't be wise and understanding. It can't be, according to Rambam. If this is true scientifically, then it cannot possibly contradict the Torah, because the Torah says we're supposed to be smart and we're supposed to be understanding. And in order to do that, that means we have to believe what science teaches us to be true. And this is very relevant for today. If somebody, according to Rambam, it is unequivocally clear that if somebody comes and tells you that the Torah tells you and teaches you to believe something that we know scientifically to be not true, Rambam would say that that is so, sir, that contradicts the verse which states that we are to be a wise and understanding people. The Torah cannot possibly tell us something that contradicts something that has been proven to be true through science. However, when the wicked from among the ignorant communities ruined our good qualities, when people that are in Rambam's name called wicked, from the ignorant communities, and Pines here on the bottom points out that the Judeo-Arabic, the Arabic term that he used for ignorant, means ignorant, but it also has refers to the pagans, the pre-Islamic pagans that lived in Arabia and before Islam took over, right? Before they became monotheistic, right? So in other words, he's comparing these pagans, these people that had no belief in God, no belief and understanding of monotheism, right? They destroyed our words of wisdom and our compilations and caused our men of knowledge to perish, so that we again became ignorant, right? And remember, what does Rambam consider ignorant here? He considers them ignorant as we had been threatened because of our sins. For it says, as it says, and this is he's quoting Isaiah Yeshayahu in Paragraph Tes, where he says, like that the wisdom of its wise men will be lost, uvinat nibonav, and the understanding of its understanding people, tistatar, will be hidden, or will disappear. So in other words, we lost the science and we became ignorant and started interpreting Torah in a literal way, which I'm trying to tell you can do, right? When furthermore, we mingled with these communities and their opinions were taken over by us, as were their morals and actions. For just as it says regarding the similarity of actions, they mingled with themselves with the communities and learned their works, right? It says with regard to the adoption by us of the opinions of the ignorant, and they please themselves in the children of strangers, which is a verse in Isaiah, which literally by most of the classic commentaries, they understand this to mean we intermarried with others. But Rambam doesn't understand it that way. Rambam thinks that he uses the translation of the Targum Yonos and Ben Uziel, and we walk according to the laws of the Gentiles. So what Rambam understands this to mean is we threw away science. What does it mean when the Torah says we lost our wise men? It means we stopped thinking about science. We stopped doing proper research. We stopped reading and believing scientific evidence, and we started interpreting the Torah literally and imagining it in this in this corporealistic and immature way, right? In consequences of this, we grew up accustomed to the opinions of the ignorant. These philosophic views appeared to be, as it were, foreign to our law. People then thought that Aristotle's views were foreign to Torah, but they were never foreign to Torah. Aristotle's views, according when Rambam says, science was always part of Torah. So when it says we lose. So you have the irony of this, the power of this is immense, because many traditional Jews would look at those verses and say, when we lost the wisdom of the wise ones, they're thinking about the Chazal, our great rabbis, had so much greatness in Torah, and we lost that greatness. Well, Rambam is stating over here, no, it's not Torah that we lost. It's science that we lost. It's philosophy that we lost. So we're looking at Torah in such an immature way. We lost that, and that's what Yeshayahu was lamenting, right? As the overflow from the deity and from the intellects has been mentioned repeatedly in our discourse, we must explain to you its true reality. So the next thing I want to do is explain to you, what do I mean when I say there's overflow coming from God, right? I mean that of the subject that is designated as overflow. After that, I shall start upon the discourse concerning the worlds being produced in time. So Rambam just told us in the next chapter, I'm going to teach you about what do I mean by this overflow from God? What is this overflow, right? And number two, after that, in chapter 13, I'm going to start my discussion as to the creation of the universe, as opposed to the universe having been immortal and always existing, which is where Rambam argues on Aristotle and famously argues for a time of creation, a moment of creation. So that concludes this chapter 11, which is a powerful chapter, and I think extremely relevant and interesting, and but I believe is relevant to today. Do you have any questions or observations? Got to unmute yourself if you do.
I guess about halfway through, there's a discussion of the substrata and one substratum to another, that a substratum is immutable in its essence, and the third by the bodies subject to generation and corruption.
Oh, yes. Okay. Yeah.
Everything above means this substratum refers to the earth, I guess. Is that
Yes.
and,
Yes. Right.
and
So,
everything above that is considered immutable and unchanged?
yes, because in their view, right, they obviously didn't know yet that stars come into existence and leave existence like we do observe today. So in their view, the spheres within which the stars and the planets were fixed were permanent, and they were always there. They don't come to be. They don't get born and die. And the difference between this world that we see on planet Earth and everything that happens above us, the main difference being that this world is subject to what Rambam keeps on calling generation and corruption, whereas those worlds are not subject to generation and corruption, which is part of what makes them greater than us, right?
Mhm.
It's a very important idea because I don't know how to emphasize this enough. That because so many philosophers, especially religious philosophers, emphasize the the human being as the ultimate goal, as like the most important, as the whole thing is here for us, right? Everything was meant in order to create the human being and the greatness. Ramam is exactly the opposite, and he hones in on this fact that we're just a result. We're an overflow of an overflow of an overflow of an overflow that landed in this world here, which is worse. Worse. I mean, worse is not the right term, but which is lower, because there is generation and corruption, because we're not permanent, and we're farther, much farther from God, so to speak. Assume, obviously using distance in reference to God is inappropriate, but just as a matter of speech. And it's tremendous because it helps us understand when Rambam talks about Ava and Ira, love and fear of God, and awe of God, and what humility really is. It helps us understand what humility is. So when we look above, we see things that are greater and more vast and more tremendous than us, as opposed to seeing things that are there for our benefit. Does that
The
make sense?
corruption doesn't have to do with any
No,
moral.
it's not a moral issue. Here,
It's
corruption
decay.
just
It's
means
just physical decay. Is that correct?
exactly. Yeah, exactly. 100%. Yes. I want to start chapter 12. The only problem is that it's long. I mean, it's not physically long, but it's going to take a while to get through. And I don't know. And if I just start it and not finish it, it's going to be it's a complete entity. So I think it makes sense to leave chapter 12 to the next lecture and stop here, because this chapter 12 is I'm going to cover in a whole lecture, if that makes sense.
Yeah, sure. No
Okay.
problem. Thank you
Um,
very much for the private tutoring.
Oh, sure, sure. No problem. Even if no one showed up, I would still do it because it is recorded anyway. But
Mhm.
having you here it's made it a lot easier to teach to a real person, and I appreciate your engagement. Thank you so much for joining.
Okay.
Thank you.
Have a good
Thank you.
evening, and I'll
Thank
see
you.
you next week.
Yes.
Okay.
Mr. Sham. Bye.
Bye.